All right, so today we're going to talk about shading, and before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit about proportions. So the goal here isn't necessarily to make an exact copy, but we're going to shoot for as close as possible. So it's best if you have a printout that you can lay next to where you're going to be doing your drawing. This is going to be a fairly lengthy video, so what I have here is a 4H and an HB. You don't have to use that specifically, but my recommendation would be use a soft pencil or a medium pencil and then something hard. So I will be using the darker pencil, the HB, so you can kind of see what I'm doing, and I'll talk through this video and sort of explain what I'm doing. So up until this point, everything should be fairly familiar in terms of how to lay out your drawing using the T method, and then using also this idea of measuring for the center line. So none of this should be fairly new, so I'll probably just not talk a whole lot unless there's something specific that I have to mention. So what I'm going to do is kind of break down the measurements, the distance between the top of the hat and the bill, and some of this is guesswork. Of course, it's not super hard to guess when you have your reference side by side. This is the big advantage from drawing from a printed material versus drawing from an iPad or your phone. The biggest problem being that you can't lay out, say, straight edges. You don't have a grid that you can work with unless you have a Photoshop or something on your program, on your phone. With this, you could have a ruler, and you could mark out with a see-through ruler the difference in height, meaning that if you were to draw a line straight across, you would see that this should be at an angle, and so the top of this eyebrow should be, for example, that much higher. You wouldn't be able to do that with drawing from a phone. So if you're still working on your proportions, I would recommend using printed material, because you can actually draw grids all over this to help guide you. So here's something I find to be useful is draw a triangle from the corner of the eye to the center of the nose. Okay, so this will work best if you have a straight edge or see-through ruler. Let me try that with a pen. This is one of those things that is also super helpful to do, and that it's not something that's talked about enough. People who've learned to do portraits do this quite a bit, and they sort of just get used to it. So you could do this mentally, but also helps if you sort of at least try to get close in terms of not just the shape or the size, but make sure that the angles are close. Obviously, if this triangle is too narrow, then I know that there's something wrong with my proportions. And then for figuring out the distance, right, you can use, this is another technique that I use along with this T method, as I make a little oval, and that'll kind of give me the distance at the top of the lip, and then I can figure out where the mouth is. Okay, and all this is, you know, subject to change a little bit when you make your initial marks. Like, for example, I know I made mine a little bit thinner with the anticipation that I would be changing or modifying whatever needs to change. So my teacher used to say, the most important thing about a drawing is learning how to start. And I think that's probably true. You can spend years and years trying to figure out, you know, how to finish a drawing, or what that even means to you, what level of finish, or whether it's necessary or not, and then where you want to back off from there. But what he meant was learning how to set up a drawing and have all your structure down first. That's probably some of the most important things that is usually glossed over, or things that you probably may not pay attention to enough in the beginning. So we have to come up with ways where we can do these things and they're not intimidating, which is why I like to use geometry, because there isn't really anything intimidating by drawing squares and triangles. Okay, so I don't need some of these lines anymore. Another way to check your proportions is check the width of the nose against the inside of the eye, and that'll sort of let you know if you're on the right track. So pretty close. It means I have to make this a tiny bit bigger. And you know, in the beginning when you draw older people, they almost always start off looking younger, because you probably shouldn't focus too much on wrinkles and surface information right away, in my opinion. I think that should develop a little bit later. So at this point, everything is still fairly geometric and very much a line drawing, where I'm sort of using line to represent boundaries. And I'll show you one of the crucial steps in terms of shading that can really fast track your drawing, which is something we haven't talked about yet. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're going to plot our shadows using a technique that's called posterization. And posterization is really, the way you do this is you squint at your piece, and you only want to do light and dark. You don't want to do anything like light gray, at least not in the beginning. So you basically see, if you can see where my pencil is, I'm following these divisions, and I'm going to be creating this shape. And if you're not sure if it's light or shadow, you know, like for example here, that would definitely qualify as shadow. So you go ahead and lump it as a shadow. And I'll show you exactly what I'm doing. So first, I don't know if you can see that. Let me move this up a little bit. First, what you want to do is plot out the shape. So this is going to require as much time as you need. And I'm kind of using the side of the pencil, so it's a little bit of a broad stroke instead of trying to make a line. I want it to be a little bit broken, kind of about that wide. And really spend the time to make this as complex of a shadow as you observe, because it'll pay off once you move on to the next stages. So here we're sort of encountered by, whoops, that's not what I meant to do. That was a pen. Oh well. Here you're sort of encountered by this eyebrow, and I'm gonna go ahead and throw in the whole shape to account for shadow. And then same thing with the eye. I realize this is a little bit tricky, and other examples would probably be a little bit easier. And there's a little gap of light here. I see this little square of the cheek, and I'm going to go ahead and include that for the shadow shape. Same thing with this little section of the bottom. This whole shape here including the nostril. And so this is one of those techniques that's usually taught to you when you go to art school and you pay a ton of money, and it's unfortunate that this isn't really taught anywhere. I would say that a lot of people either don't know it, or if they do know it, they don't disclose what they're doing, probably for the same reasons, because they had spent a lot of money themselves learning these techniques, which this technique is known as the Bargue method, and it really comes out of France, French 19th century academic drawing techniques. So I'm going to do the same thing with this eyebrow, and then group the top of the eyelid, the entire eye, this is also known as posterizing. It doesn't really matter what you call it. The only thing that really matters is that you do this and follow the next couple of steps. I'm going to go ahead and include this. The term posterization comes from a graphic design terminology, as well as, you know, things that came after that, like Photoshop. So what we're doing is we're sort of deciding, not arbitrarily, but visually, what is shadow and what is light. Literally only two values. Okay? So now the next step is very easy, and all you have to do is fill it in. And you want to fill it in flatly, meaning it's the same value for every shadow shape that you've made. Regardless if the shadow is actually darker, at this point that doesn't really matter. You just want to make all of the shadows the same darkness. I think I could include this little shape, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. The more of these shadow shapes that you make, it could end up making your drawing go by a little bit faster. So what you're going to end up with is something that looks a little bit like a poster. and you know, it'll feel a little bit generic, but that's part of this technique that will make your drawing go by, if not double the speed, pretty close to it. Notice I left this little gap. I'm going to cover the entire ear just because it makes it easier. I think the thing that becomes difficult when doing this and not following along is knowing what's shadow and what's not. And I think you'll get better at this once you've done this a few times. And there's also some exercises you can follow created by the Barg method that I can give you, and you can practice those things, and those things kind of help train your eye and being able to make your own decisions on where to make those divisions. And you could do a little bit, you could do one here, I guess. It's not, that part's not super important. So, let's go over this a little bit, do some refining. At this point, you can sort of go in and make some small adjustments. So when I'm doing this, I'm paying attention to the angles, and the more angles that I think that I can accomplish, I think the more realistic my result will be, rather than if I resort to one or two angles. I think if I have three or four, you'll probably get a little bit closer.